and Javier, sir.
Yeah.
One minute.
Take 1 minute.
दुबे सर अनम्यूट करके स्टार्ट कर सकते हैं सर। रोड्रिक सर भी अनम्यूट करके स्टार्ट कर सकते हैं।
So should we begin now?
You should ask Roderick sir also to unmute.
Please, you can begin, sir.
Javier is unmuted, so we can begin now.
Yeah, definitely.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see such a large number of people connected with Indore Study Circle. Our speaker today is Javier Fernandez. You have heard him once, and I'm really thankful that Javier accepted our request and he is with us today again, even though it's a little too early in Amsterdam. You know Javier, but I'll briefly give an introduction of Javier. Javier comes originally from Spain. In his mid-teens, he came across the work of Krishnaji and was instantly struck by its wholeness and ring of truth. From 75 to 78, Javier was a student at Brackwood Park School, the school which was founded by Krishnaji in England in 1969. After completing his BA in the Humanities and MA in Spanish language and literature from USA, he returned to Brockwood Park as a teacher in 1990. There he met up with Krishnaji's close collaborator, Dr. David Bohm, and actively engaged with him in the exploration of the letter's dialogue proposals. There is a booklet of Xavier with a dialogue with Dr. Bohm. I couldn't circulate it because I got a little late, or maybe I saw it a little late, but I'll do it so that you can have an idea of what dialogue is. Javier spent 2 years from 1993 to 95 as a resident scholar at Chennai Krishnamurti Foundation India headquarters. On his return to Spain, he conducted a Krishnamurti-inspired inquiry group, translated several Krishnamurti books into Spanish, and became a trustee of the Latin American Foundation, the K Foundation responsible for disseminating his work in the Spanish-speaking world. He also joined Krishnamurti Link International, an informal group of former Brockwood uh, staff members brought together by the German industrialist Frederick Grohe, who was K's close friend during the last 2-3 years of his life and a lifelong financial supporter to almost all the K institutions worldwide. Javier was one of the main editors of KLI's magazine, Link, which served as an international forum for study of the Krishnamurti teachings. In 2000, Javier moved to Netherlands, where he has been residing ever since. He has been collaborating with the Dutch Krishnamurti Committee and continues to be associated with KLI. He edits Frederick's newsletter, an yearly newsletter which comes to all of us, and he is quite active in KLI's international network of activities. In 2016, Javier started giving a course offering a comprehensive introduction to Krishnamurti's life and teachings. The idea for this course stems from his sense that they are universal in nature and a potential avenue of significant insight and fundamental change. As such, he feels they deserve the closest study as well as widest dissemination. If they are veritable education, if they are a veritable education for mankind. Javier is currently working on compiling a book on K's life and teachings based on his research for the course. With the outbreak of the pandemic, he is hoping to be able to offer his introduction to K's life and teachings online in the near future. With these words, I welcome Javier once again, and he is going to talk to us on dialogue and inquiry. Javier, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Mr. Dubey. um, where to begin? First of all, the whole notion of dialogue, as in the introduction, as was conveyed already in the introduction, stems mostly from my encounter with David Bohm, re-encounter really with David Bohm back in 1990 at Brookwood. Now, that has specifically to do with a particular development of that notion. Kay also had it before that, but we had not really given it perhaps the importance that it had. We had not really paid much attention to the fact that maybe we were developing an approach that was significant in itself, and that we could then, as a whole, take it on board as a whole when Kay was not there. This was part of Bohm's idea. I'm not going to talk only about Bohm, by the way, but generally. But I'm just saying that had a major significance for me, because it elevated the whole notion of dialogue to another level. And I want to talk about that. Kay had talked all his life, had tried to convey in words what he knew could not be conveyed in words. That sounds contradictory. If truth cannot be conveyed to another, then what's the point of speaking? That was a major, major challenge, but he insisted. We must be able to communicate, to think together, to hold a dialogue as human beings, right? We're all one. You are the world and the world is you. And why is that? Because we all share one same common consciousness. There's no consciousness of India. There's no consciousness of the West. There is human consciousness that takes these different forms. We give importance to the form and we forget the essence. Dialogue for Kay meant, as he used to put it, a conversation between two friends. Now, luckily, these guys were already friends. Most people aren't. So that was an advantage. I take it we are all friends. So I'll take make that assumption. But they were two friends sitting on a bench in a park under the dappled light. Kay liked to be out under the trees and with his friend. And what do they talk about? They talk about their lives. These two friends, like friends do, right? If you have a friend, you sit wherever it is or walk and you talk about your life. There's a quality of communication that is, of course, instant, because you're not calculating what the reaction is going to be, whether your words are going to be met kindly or being rejected, or you're going to enter into some kind of dispute. There is already an underground current or basis of affection and care that is implied in that conversation. Unfortunately, if we start a conversation just as human beings who do not know one another and who are not having that feeling of friendship, then you enter into another level of challenge. What does it mean to communicate? And do we have that general concern that communication is of the essence? What is communication? So communication means to bring across a meaning such that it becomes common to both of us. something becomes common. When I say something that is true, is a fact, it's snowing in the Netherlands. Fortunately, that's a fact. I'm not inventing it because words can invent. Then that becomes a fact, right? And of course, it will be much more of a fact if I'm talking to somebody in my room and they have their backs turned to the window. I open the curtains and I see, oh, it's snowing. They can turn around and they look at the snow and say, oh, by Jove, it is. You can confirm the same fact, right? A word is just a pointer. The word is not the thing. And that is a very interesting new problem. Because if the word is not the thing can be whatever it wants to be. And therefore we can invent, give it any content. So we have to be very observant, pay very close attention to words as to whether they have an actual referent, they signify, or they don't. When we say that to communicate means to share meaning, means to see the same thing, perceive the same significance, with the same intensity. That was Kay's idea. Remember Kay's, you all will probably know it, it's a kind of formula, become a kind of formula. And we have to be wary of formulas, which is communication is to be at the same level, at the same time, with the same intensity, about the same thing. Now, most of us know that that seldom happens in our conversations. So we cannot take it for granted. We have to become aware of whether we are or not at the same level, with the same intensity, at the same time. I couldn't possibly be at the same level as Professor Bohm's enthusiasm, intensity, and understanding of quantum mechanics, because I didn't have that knowledge. I didn't even have the mathematical apparatus to be able to comprehend the formulas he might be drawing on the blackboard. So I couldn't be there. So that's partly the awareness of the particular subject that one has, right? And yet, if I had the skills and the mental equipment, or could gain it, eventually I could be on a similar level. So we have to also realize that there are different levels. And there are different levels of intensity, even when we have the same level of knowledge, because there are different takes on the meaning. Now, the word meaning is one of those words that kind of like an infinite series of mirrors, it vanishes into infinity. The meaning of meaning and meaning, you can keep on asking that question until there is absolutely no meaning to that word. But in common ordinary English, as Professor Bohm used to point out, it has three principal meanings. So even the word has a meaning, you see. So it points to something, first of all, as we said, right? The word snow points to something, points to this white substance that's falling outside and that's covering my backyard and my car. And the word points. The word snow is not the snow. The Eskimos have 80 words for snow. They're lucky. We have just about one. We're a bit poor in that distinction because it comes from distinctions. Right? There's a perception, subtle. They live in the snow, so they have to tell very subtle distinctions of the snow. That's what they have to look at most of the time. So they have 80 words for it. So that there's different kinds of snow. Right? But we have one word, snow. The word is not the thing, but it points to the thing. And we trust, of course, there's a general consensus that we have to trust that the word is pointing to something, right? That it has a referent. But whether we see the referent or not, that becomes the question, especially when we're talking about things that apparently cannot be so easily perceived, like through the senses, as snow. Right? Questions of ideology, questions of religious belief, questions of all kinds of fantastic constructions that our minds make out of its desire for security or its fear of uncertainty. We create mental constructs to provide ourselves artificial stimulants for safety, for comfort. And that becomes the word, becomes the thing psychologically. So there, paying attention to words becomes tremendously important, because some words don't have the meaning that we give to it, or the meaning that they have is actually contrary to what we intend, like security. You know, that would be another inquiry. But what I'm saying is we give words meaning. So do they point to something? That's the first meaning of a word, of meaning. Does it refer to something actual, or is it an invention? Second, when we say, this means a lot to me, that means that that thing has a lot of value. So meaning also indicates value. What is meaningful to us is what is valuable. My country means a lot to me. My what? My library, my belief, my religion. So meaning has that other meaning of value, not only reference, significance, that something points to something, but value. And also purpose. That is, what has value to me also indicates where my purpose lies, where my direction is. We all are conditioned to value things, sometimes in greatly mistaken ways, but we value those things, and that gives a purpose. And in English, you say that, I mean to do this. So what we mean to do is also part of what words, what our sentences, what our thoughts convey. Those three are fundamental to understand what we are sharing in terms of meaning and what determines our action in the world. And those things are conveyed by words in communication, whether it comes through the collective stream of consciousness or through our own thinking and reflection, it doesn't matter. It comes from the general pool of meaning, and is actually a discovery or just the tradition moving through us. Tradition being very old or very modern, it doesn't matter. That's what conditions us. That's what tells us what the reference are, if they are, what the values are, and therefore what our purposes should be. It's a determinant. That's why the question of dialogue is important, first of all, because it looks at the constructs that thought makes and how those constructs actually make sense in terms of bringing about a quality of order in our lives or not. If the meanings are not coherent, are actually not referring to anything, and the values are wrongly assigned, then our purposes are also mistaken. And therefore our lives become a general mess, not only individually, but collectively. Nationalism is being given tremendous importance. Religious belief, tremendous importance. Caste, class, race, you name it. We've given importance to things that don't have importance. So that becomes a major quality of inquiry. That's why we have to question these things. But above all, we have to be aware of how we live, because the meaning of things is determined in action. And whether those actions really, the purpose is action, right? What you do. If those actions really lead and bring about the quality of harmony and order that we're aiming at, or end up in their contrary effects. This is what you call incoherence. What we're doing is generally, we're engaging in a series of contradictions. Now, you know what that means, right? Contradicere, to say against. So it's a series of contraries, opposites. We say one thing, we do another. We think something is valuable, we act upon it, and it ends up producing its contrary effects. I think the nation leads to security, but it actually leads to conflict. There are major, major contradictions in our thinking, collectively as well as individually. And we see it when the intended results are actually the opposite of what was intended. That's incoherence. So dialogue becomes a field, potentially, in which we can together explore that dimension of the use of thinking, of the word, and to reflect, to serve as a mirror in which we can begin to see what our concepts are, what our values are, what our convictions are, what our conditioning actually is, because it's also entrenched in thinking, and whether that is coherent or not. Because if there is a contradiction, that's the signal that something is mistaken, that we have made some assumptions about things that don't hold up. The question of assumptions is very important, because generally, see, an assumption, what is that? Is a kind of general thought. Right? All Muslims are terrorists. So you could make that assumption, which is a form of prejudice, right? And that goes into a kind of lower layer. Assumption is like a hypothesis. Hypothesis means that which you lay down as the basis of further thought. It's like what you build on. But generally, we just go on the secondary thoughts without being aware of what the foundational thought was. Hypothesis, to set down below. So is the lower layer. And those are universal in nature. All, they have the all in them, or never, or none. So they are of a universal nature, and that gives them power. Because the moment you recognize that category, that universal statement kicks in. And if we're not aware of it, the action could be devastating, because the universality of the statement itself calls for total action. And usually, as our identities are also involved, and it can release enormous energy, usually of an aggressive kind. So we have, you see, the structure of thought is what we are trying to explore. How thoughts organize themselves. Partly, I didn't mention that very much yet, but their connection with feeling, and how that determines our action in the world, our relationships in the world. Now, if we are aware of the general state of fragmentation in which we move socially as well as individually, psychologically, how fragmented difficult our relationships become. If there is no communication, or if the communication is fraught with contradictions, with these tensions, with these conflicts, then relationship, does it really exist? And relationship, as Kay never ceased to point out, quietly, but with profound intent, is life. So if we are consistently undermining, through our state of incoherence and fragmentation, the field of relationship, we're making our lives, well, I was going to use a Christian term, a living hell. Okay? So that becomes our responsibility. And it is therefore very important that we become aware of what our responsibility are in all this, and whether we want to contribute or not. And as we say, that's in the field of thought. So dialogue partly is a proposal whereby together, it takes the collective dimension in hand, right? It's not just my fragmentation, but it's also your fragmentation. It's the fragmentation that belongs to the field of consciousness itself, to that very statement we made earlier, that you are the world and the world is you, because consciousness is one single movement, universal movement. The structure of fragmentation is inbuilt in that consciousness by now. So together, if we see that, for example, we have to take it on board, the challenge of saying, can we together meet that challenge? You and I embody that fragmentation. What are we going to do about it? Do you condemn me for my fragmentation and I condemn you for yours? Or we say, oh, fuck, we are in the same boat. Yes, I have my flaws, you have yours. Thank you very much. Can we together look into it Can we learn together about what we are and how we are responsible individually and collectively for the overall disorder in the world? It has to do with what we think, how we feel, what our notions of ourselves are. Ultimately, that's where it goes, is self-knowledge, self-understanding. Is it possible? And as Kay said, we need mirrors to be able to see ourselves, right? We somehow, it's very odd, isn't it, that we don't somehow have an inner inbuilt mirror. Perhaps we do, but we don't lay emphasis on it. Perhaps something like meditation may be such an inner mirror, just paying attention to the stream of thought. Thought itself is a manifestation, and it's manifest as thought, indeed, as something that is displayed. So it can be seen. And that's an art, the art of seeing, not just outwardly, but inwardly, what thought is. That's why Kay, in his schools, we used to tell us, meditate. Sounds like a system, doesn't it? Contrary to the spirit of Kay. Well, he had a particular intent in that. I think maybe he was more emphatic at Proprioception because we were Westerners and we didn't have that background culture. So he wanted us to learn something about what it meant to spend time with ourselves, looking at our thinking and feeling, so that we would become aware of it, not just outwardly. But the primary mirror he always emphasized was relationship, how it's all unfolding in our reactions to people, right? That's where we come alive. That's our life. Relationship is our reactions, our absorption of things, what we make of what is happening, right? We are happening, so are you, and what we make together, right, in our lives. So that becomes our primary mirror. But we can also together come together and start talking. If the word is an expression of thought, and thought is an expression of that consciousness that is universal, not just private to me, then we have a means, potentially, of reflecting that consciousness back to itself in the act of talking. And maybe that also may help, as a mirror, to become aware of the whole movement of consciousness itself, because that's what we are needing to do. Consciousness hides its own structure somehow, tricks itself into not seeing what it actually does. We lack, essentially, we lack self-awareness. Bohm called it proprioception, which is basically the Latin word that means exactly the same, self-awareness. Right? He borrowed it from physiology, and that was very interesting because he could then further make another metaphor. That is that if the body, you would see the body is self-aware, right? So it knows when it moves, when it doesn't, what belongs to it and what doesn't. That's essential for its survival, right? But sometimes, apparently, due to certain pathologies, that sense of self-awareness can be lost, in which case massive confusion results. Therefore, I wouldn't be knowing whether I'm moving my hand. It could be my hand could not be, I could take it for someone else's hand. So if I touch my face, it would be somebody else touching my face. In which case I will be reacting, maybe they're slapping me or something, So I would react as though somebody else is acting upon me. So this is what's happening with thought. It does something. We're not aware of our doing it, and therefore we react towards it as though it's an independent object, independent of us. Our fears, our pleasures, our desires suddenly result in actions that seem to be independent of us. We create problems that we say we must solve. But we can't solve those problems unless we realize that we are at the source. So if we lose track of thought, which is what is happening, we won't be able to see it. Thought becomes reflex. That's what conditioning means. Look at it. If we say we are conditioned, and we turn in this kind of circle, we tend to accept that kind of statement. That's what it means. It means that thought goes into the reflex system and then acts mechanically and blindly without regard to what actually is there, but only in relation to something it identifies from its own past. That very trap of the past that identifies the present and reacts according is one of the major sources of division and conflict in the world, therefore of fragmentation. To be aware of that is a primary responsibility that we all have. Maybe we're saying dialogue in terms of being able to explore, like as two friends, the issues of our lives may serve as a mirror in which that, even at the level of the reflex system, can begin to uncover the depths of our conditioning. And therefore, in the light of seeing, in the light of insight, create the ground of freedom, bring about the quality of freedom that we need in order to see what is and act accordingly with a sense of care. Otherwise, we will carry on, making each other's lives impossible. I hope not. At the moment, we're all in isolation, so we're pretty safe from one another. But yet we're doing all kinds of things in the world. We are up with the news, what's happening. We're not being very nice about this all. Right? So I wanted to suggest something else. Well, how late is it? 7:07. Okay, just half an hour. Okay. So this is a general outlook of more or less what the proposal is intended to do. And partly, as Bohm sometimes suggested, it came from this sense, the following sense, and why it would be relevant, for example, and specifically relevant to such a context as the so-called K world. I mean, it has become practically a feature, doesn't it? The whole notion of dialogue. We watch a video and then we say, we're now going to have a dialogue. Well, mostly it's a discussion about what K said and whether we understand what K said. That's all right. There's a question of partly a matter of study. And we need to study, and K's insight goes so deep, it's even very hard to understand sometimes what he actually said. All thought is sorrow. Wait a minute. You pause, right? You pause. That insight goes very deep. All thought is sorrow. It stuns me. It stops me. I want to believe. I want to believe. You see, we want to believe that thought is more than sorrow. That it can actually light the way to some truth, to some freedom, to some order. By Jove, if all thought is sorrow, we have to really get through it, to the bottom of it, in order to find some light. Sorrow is darkness. So, all right, you may also have a point to make. Sorrow, universal sorrow. All thought is sorrow. That phrase is still at the back of my mind, and I cannot get rid of it because I get the feeling that there's a great truth in it, which I'm not grasping, right? So we have to find out, what was I saying? This feeling of communication in the end has to do with this search for freedom. But within the K world itself, one of the issues that has arisen in relation to dialogue is how we go about it. How do we proceed together with this inquiry? When K was there, it was relatively easy. It was challenging, like I just said, because he was amazingly challenging. He went beyond this whole shadowy world of consciousness. So, by Jove, he always put us on the spot as playing around with shadows and trying to create order, like Plato's cave. So, how do we go about it, you see? K was there. He was the speaker. He was the voice of truth. He conveyed perception directly in words, so that his words were referring to something that he was actually seeing. That's the beauty of the thing. That's the miracle of it. Not an invention, not a conveyor of tradition, not tradition mongering, but the actual perception. This is the extraordinary quality of such a mind. But then he goes, the speaker is silent. And we're left there with his teachings, beautiful things that they are. But how do we proceed ourselves? Is it just an individual matter, like many say? It's just up to you. You have to figure it out for yourself. That is true, by the way. But he said, you are the world. Which means it's not me. It's everyone. It's mankind. But each of us somehow insists on staying in their own little corner. It's like it's all a private, personal affair. In a way it is. I value privacy. But yet, whatever is happening to me is happening out of that background of consciousness and is echoing back into it. Consciousness is one whole stream, is universal in nature, and it concerns us all. If we are concerned with our lives, then we have to be concerned with consciousness and with the universal human experience. Fear is not yours or mine at the end of the day, nor is love, nor is violence. It's universal. And therefore, that would be a good ground, in my opinion, for all of us, for everybody, to engage in that reflection concerning our lives. That is the proposal of dialogue. And that's, Kay used to say it very quietly, and it was not perhaps easy to grasp, therefore, the meaning, the profound meaning that he put on the phrase, we talk together as human beings, not as specialists, not as somebody knows and somebody does not know, but as human beings, sharing, talking about their lives. If we already have the sense that we are the world, then a certain feeling of respect, of mutual consideration is already inbuilt in it. I can't ignore your suffering because I know my suffering is also yours. See, we just have this capacity to separate ourselves so drastically from another. So that becomes fundamental. If I'm concerned with the universality of our human condition, then I already have, in many ways, embraced the other, because the other is me, in some fundamental sense. That cannot be ignored anymore. You are the world, and the world is you. But look what the world is, and look what you are. But that's the point, that interface, that interaction between world and self, the self-world, the world-self, which we are creating, co-creating, is not something independent. To even become to that point, in actuality, to sense it in consciousness, is one fundamental purpose, one fundamental intent of this proposal. The thought, consciousness, is inherently participatory. Whatever you think over there in your own office and I in my own room is part of that stream, comes from the stream and goes back to the stream. Not only when we're interacting, but in our very thinking, we are part of the stream. Kay used to say, as long as you're thinking, you're not alone. Meaning, you're still in the collective movement, right? To be alone, therefore, means something else. Of course, he gave it very deep meaning, right? Of the total integrity, the total oneness, the all oneness, not even of something, the all oneness. The alone speaks to the alone, the all oneness. So that was something much deeper, right, than this stream of consciousness itself. universal as that is, and fundamental as it is, in order to bring about the quality of cooperation, universal cooperation, because it dissolves all kinds of barriers, all divisions really, is still itself not quite the end of the story, because it's still trapped in time, and we have to go further. But we can't go further unless we really see it, unless we together find a way to experiment and actually perceive the total participatory nature of our being. This is part of what dialogue is intended to do in this particular approach. There are many approaches. This is one of them, which I find, at least from my perspective, especially relevant to this kind of inquiry, to this kind of concern with our own human nature, with the understanding of consciousness, and with the freedom of man. So that becomes one of the approaches. I don't want to go too far in my time because I want to leave a little time for dialogue. Otherwise, I'm kind of contradicting myself. And that's the challenge of talking. See if you can not contradict yourself. So now, Bohm had a further thing in relation to how dialogue might contribute to bringing about this awareness of the common consciousness that we share, because that is not even is a concept mostly. In general, when we talk together, the separateness takes precedence. We're not even there yet. We don't have the sense of a shared meaning, which is how culture is generated, right? We have many subcultures. We have many specialized identities, separate identities, whereas we're talking about one universal stream. And can we act from there, no matter what our further differences may be concerning our jobs or our whatever cultures, that we operate from that ground of universality such that there can be such a thing as compassion. We won't be able to feel for another if we have such entrenched separateness as we continue to have. Compassion cannot be in that field. So, and it's essential. Only out of compassion will we really bring about a different world where we care for our children and for everything else, nature. Look what is happening. So this becomes important because Bohm had one simple example. Look, very interesting one, which I like very much, because he suggested that communication is much more subtle than just the meaning of words. It has to do with the sharing itself. And I discovered this also eventually, because I did experiment with this, and I'll tell you in a second. He mentioned the case just as an illustration of what is possible in terms of bringing about this quality, actual awareness of the universality of consciousness, or the common consciousness, which was of some American Indian tribes, which a friend of his, or I think it was a friend of his, an anthropologist, has studied. And these American tribes, there were a group of about 30 or so. Periodically, they would get together, have the so-called powwows. They would dance and sing and smoke the pipe. I wouldn't smoke the pipe myself, but there was a peace pipe, so it's all right. I would smoke for peace. Now, they would then sit down and start sharing what was on their minds, right? They are living together and they're sharing together what was on their minds. But apparently, they didn't do it like in our modern parliaments. Parliaments, parler means to talk, right? With the talking places that govern our lives. They didn't do it like that, of arguments and positions, preconceived positions of right, left, center, and so on, and argument and then vote. But rather, apparently, everyone said what was on their mind and took turns to do so. And that took them about a group of 30 people living in fairly simple conditions, took them about 3 days to empty their minds of their content. You know, that's one of the definitions Kay used of meditation, right? To empty consciousness of its content is the meaning of meditation. So that dialogue was a form of meditation for these guys, in the sense of they emptied the content of their consciousness, but in emptying it, what they did is they shared it also. And according to the anthropologists, the curious thing was happening, that without decision making, without voting, without argument, the group itself, the little tribe, then afterwards functioned harmoniously, because everybody was aware of everybody else's thoughts. They had shared their consciousness, and therefore they could act coherently, at least in relation to their own tribe. Don't know beyond that, but at least at that level, they could act coherently, consistently, without this harmony, which is something we are not even managing to do, right? So that was interesting. The sense of sharing of consciousness is fundamental if we're going to live together in harmony, right? But that also gives you the sense of a universality beyond you. You are in relationship. And by knowing what is on other people's minds, you're in relation to them because you're sharing their consciousness. You're sharing their lives, just like every day you share their lives, the space, the building, the running, the looking after the horses. All of that is also in your mind. You're sharing all that and that fundamental meaning. So you can act coherently. And this is fundamental, right? In my experimentation, which I was very impressed by Bohm's proposal, which is much more sophisticated than what I have described, which has to do with creativity and conditioning and all that, which we can inquire into. When I returned to Spain, as Mr. Dubé kindly told us, I did want to experiment, because to me, Kay always said, is this a fact for you, or is it just an idea? So I never forgot that. Kay used to drive me insane by always saying, is this a fact to you, or is it just an idea? I could never tell. So I said, all right, is this just an idea, or is it a fact? And how would you know? Well, you have to experiment. So I said, okay, let's do that. So a group of friends got together. Well, it wasn't even my initiative, it was somebody else's. They had organized a week of encounters with Krishnamurti. And then somebody said, but that was too interesting to let it go at 1 week. We should just continue somehow. Can that be done? So they organized a meeting and they invited me. I had just returned from India and they invited me. And so we decided to organize dialogues on a weekend, the last weekend of every month, for the whole day. This wasn't just 2 hours, it was the whole day. We meet at 10 o'clock, go through lunch, and then stay on in the evening. It was a monastery where we met, because there was a monk there very interested in Krishnamurti, and they had plenty of space. You know, monasteries are huge places, but monks are few. So they had lots of spaces, you see. So they kindly let us use the space for free. This is the beauty of religion. They were kind and generous with us. And we appreciated that very much. So we met there the last Sunday of every month for the whole day. When they closed the monastery at 5, the urge to talk was such that sometimes a group of us would just walk across to a cafe across the street and carry on until 10, even though we had to go and drive home for another couple of hours. The need to share is fundamental in our lives, isn't it? And we don't perhaps give each other enough space to be able to do so. So that's part of it. Though we have a deeper purpose in terms of serving as a mirror of what our conditioning is, there's just a more fundamental thing, that we're living isolation, and that isolation is artificially imposed by our egocentric ways and by our social structures. In England, they have a ministry of loneliness. Now that you can imagine. I mean, I used to laugh about it, but apparently it's not quite a serious matter. So the ministry of loneliness. See, the isolation that we impose upon ourselves is because of this lack of relationship and lack of communication. So that's why people were so incredibly enthusiastic about having the possibility to share. So that we had something like 20 to 30 people every weekend in that group. And the fact was that people needed that mirror. Many needed that mirror in order to begin to examine their lives seriously. The kindness that was displayed, the mutual respect, was such that it allowed people to expose themselves not to others, This was not exhibitionism or confession, but to themselves, because they were serious about it, but they needed a mirror. They needed a reflection. And many, well, several, not many, several, actually it had a massive impact on their lives. They changed course. I'm not proposing this as a, a success story. I don't like the word success. But the fact is that change occurs when one becomes aware of oneself, is able to see the contradictions one lives with, is able to break through them, and then action naturally results. But the thing is not just that. I used to have this thing about dialogue. There are three pillars. One, it's about our lives. Those two friends talk about their lives. They don't talk about some abstract theoretical stuff. They will get to it because it's inbuilt in our lives. But you start from where you are. Damn it, they're throwing me out of my job. I'm in a miserable state. I hate this world. Whatever. Or, by Jove, I won the lottery. Do you want some money? Life is so full of stuff and moments of joy and fear and pain and deep depression. Whatever it is, we're there together. I'm not in a corner. So we shared all that. Now, when you do that, you see, when you're able to express yourself and it's in this atmosphere, you become aware of yourself. Right? And that's the important thing. That, if you are really concerned with it, what it does, what we said, it allows you partly to empty the upper layers of consciousness so that a quality of order begins to arise. Conflict begins to fade, because that's what keeps us busy, isn't it? If we have a problem in relationship, you spend the rest of the day and the rest of the week thinking about nothing else, and it's just like a perennial disturbance in your life. If one can bring about a quality of awareness and attention to that and dissolve those conflicts, then the energy is there. The energy to see, the energy to live, the energy to love. Otherwise, the whole thing is the good old caveman's behavior. Give me the stick. So my thing was this. First is about your lives. So you would, as two friends, come there and say, I've had a good week or I had a bad week, or I'm having this problem in my life or that problem in my life, or I had this bit, whatever it is, you share that. Then you start inquiring into it, you see, and you do so in this format. There's no authority, there's no imposition, there's no controlling. There is a bit of facilitation in that conversations can get into glitches that are unnecessary. And if you're somewhat skillful about what it means to communicate, then you can help. That's all. And then I used to have Krishnamurti's teachings as a sounding board, because K's teachings go so deeply that they never allow us to be too contented in our little discoveries. They don't let us rest. They say there is much greater depth. So I used to have K's teachings as a backup, in the sense that they could provide a much deeper sense of what the real dimensions are of what we're dealing with. Because I solved my little problem, right? And I think, haha, then I'm okay. But then just wait a minute and it surfaces somewhere else, because the essence of problem making has not been seen through. So there is more to be seen. So that's what I did. But K was not first. K was there to put a mirror again to our lives. So it's all mirrors. But the thing is to take the issues that are actual, present, thriving, burning, and deal with them, and then see how deep we can go. One thing that I discovered, because I only had 3 pillars, but it was a bit of, when you have 3 legs, it's a bit of an unstable thing. So I was looking for something. I said, something is missing here. 4 legs better than 3. So eventually I discovered it, which was this. And I discovered it because I was challenged. You see, I was the theoretician. I was the person who told the others what it was all about, right? So I had my theory all worked out, systematic and fairly coherent as far as I could tell. But one of the people who had been participating for a while came one day and said, I don't quite get what we're doing. We come here and we talk about anything and everything. We are not aiming at solving any problems. We're not reaching any conclusions. We're just sharing consciousness in the hope that we get a common consciousness and then we go home and know how to act coherently. Well, I could have been on the beach reading a good book. I could have been talking to my daughter who's going through the troubles of adolescence. I could be helping my sister, looking after my sister who's having some health issues, serious health issues. Instead, I'm coming here to talk to you guys about everything and nothing. What? Here's the point. She had nearly not come, but he decided to come and ask the question because dialogue is about questioning. So I felt, all right. So my machine was, I was about to turn on my, my record and tell again the same story. This is what it is about. Don't you see, my darling, and so on. But no, I said to myself, I know my story. Why should I repeat it? Maybe she's right. Maybe this is another entertainment, Sunday Mass. And we just, you know, it serves us to break away a little bit from this isolation and loneliness in which we are. So that becomes the motive. But this is not quite what is intended. What is going on here? So I didn't reply. I let the question linger. And I went home at the end of the day and I realized something. That after you spend a day, at least that was what then, talking, but mostly listening. You don't spend a day talking. You spend a day listening. That quality of listening makes for sensitivity. Depends on the depth. That sensitivity is itself the key to communication. The silence actually behind the word, through the word, that makes the word find its right place. So next time, and you see, the thing that was happening is that I was meeting my brother and talking to him. The dog, when he came around, I was relating to the dog. I was greeting the neighbor properly. I was really listening to the crows that were cawing. They had their nest in a tall pine tree across the road. There was sensitivity. There was communication beyond the word, right? So next time I went we had the following Sunday, back to the meeting, and I said, I think I've discovered something. The fourth pillar is invisible, but without it, nothing holds. Okay, I won't go any further because otherwise we won't have time for anything. There's more, there's much more. Okay, we can have a discussion maybe.
Thank you, Javier. I think it was a very interesting discourse, and thanks a lot for bringing out a completely new perspective to dialogue and inquiry. I think before we take up questions, may I request Harshji to make some observations, sir? Would you like to? I'll just please unmute yourself.
I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, yes.
Okay. So first, Javier, let me say how well you have said everything and clarified and added to our understanding. As you know, you and I have been in many discussions together, dialogues even, with Krishnaji, with David Bohm, and also without Krishnaji and David Bohm, and including dialogues with David Bohm about dialogue itself. So I thought maybe I would add a little bit to what you're saying, and because what you're saying is complete and it doesn't really need any further elucidation or anything, or comment even. So I thought I would say something about dialogue. And you started by saying something about the purpose of dialogue. I think you know all this already, so you can add to it too. That it seems that there are two purposes of the dialogue. One, and David talked about, was shared meaning. Because we all tend to use words somewhat differently. Even a simple word like love can mean a million different things to different people. So one of the first things about dialogue is that in that dialogue, at that moment, when we are talking to each other, that we begin to come to some kind of shared understanding of whatever we are talking about. And to do this, as you said, it's important to listen and not to contradict anybody, to recognize that we're all looking at the same thing, and but possibly from different aspects or different perspectives, and we may be seeing different parts of the thing, but we are trying to get at the deeper truth that we are all observing or talking about, and to not get caught up in the different ways that we might be using words, to begin to generate within the dialogue the shared meaning. This is almost a prerequisite, because if there isn't this shared meaning, then the words will get in the way, as we see very often in our discussions, dialogues, that people begin to say, well, what do you mean by this? Or I didn't mean something different by this word. So that is one of the key components of dialogue. The second one, which you mentioned also, but very briefly, is questioning. It's not about what we already know about. I mean, scientists have conferences, they have discussions where each person says what they know. Yeah. And that is okay, that has its place. That's and people can disagree and say, well, I think this, and somebody else says, well, no, I think this, and this is my experience, and that is my experience. And there may be some of that in a dialogue, but that's not a central feature. The central feature of dialogue would be to arrive at a point of questioning, at a point where you actually don't know, or at least the kind of dialogue that Krishnaji and David Bohm were interested in, that you're looking at something and you're examining it right there. And as you said, the really important part of that is that we are all looking at it. It's actually the looking and the listening that is the important part. And that whatever we are saying in a dialogue arises from our immediate perception of whatever we happen to be talking, however partial it may be, however little it might be, but that it is arising from our immediate perception of what we can see. Maybe we are wrong. And it's also a way of us to therefore test whether what we are seeing is in some sense true and accurate. I think Bohm used the word accurate, saying that we are actually accurately representing what we are perceiving. Because other words he liked to use, as you know, we could be deluded, there could be illusion. There are many things that distort our perception. So another purpose of dialogue would be that when we say something which we see as true, we are putting it out there to others to as a kind of test to see whether it makes sense, that it is maybe I'm not seeing it correctly. So this is part of inquiry, and as we do it, other people, we will come across differences of perspective and so on. You know that David liked to give the example of a fish swimming in a fish tank, and somebody is watching it from the side. So he sees the fish moving, and the fish is moving across his field of view. Somebody else is looking at it end on and seeing the fish head on. So there's no movement, there's no sideways movement of the fish, so he doesn't see any movement. He just sees the fish coming towards him. Or doesn't even can't tell whether the fish is coming towards him. So one of them says the fish is moving, the other one says the fish is not. But seeming contradiction, but part of the purpose of dialogue is to admit that there could be differences of perspective, and then to try and put a picture together as a whole. Because if we ask ourselves, how can it be that he sees it as moving and I don't see it moving? We may be able to get to the deeper truth of what is happening. So this was another aspect, the inquiry. But as is implied in this, it means that everyone is intent, and I'm using that word carefully, is intent on focusing on the truth of things. And they're speaking from not what is first-hand, not second-hand, not what's remembered, but the immediate perception. Very difficult to do if you're talking about something like sorrow. It means that sorrow has to be, you have to be feeling it to be talking about it. It's not what somebody else has said or what you remembered from a time when you felt the sorrow. So these are all aspects of dialogue, which I think are relevant to our, very important for inquiry. And there's one last thing I want to say, which is, you could kind of say it's the end point. And perhaps not the best way to say, but I can't find any better words. And once again, Krishnamurti talked about it like that. Being of one mind. He said, could you be of one mind? And this was an important part of dialogue. And I can tell you, you probably know about this too, that Krishnamurti would talk with a group of people, with the trustees as well. And the most remarkable thing about it was that there was this sense, not as a theory, that everybody there was of one mind. And what you're talking about, that tribe, it did occur, that you all looked at something and you talked around it and looked at various aspects of it and so on. And at the end of it, no one had to say anything, because when you went away, you knew what to do. Because once you see the depth of things, and this was another thing that Krishnamurti was fond of saying, there are no decisions, there is only the right thing to do. And when you see something absolutely clearly, then you also see what is the right thing to do. So there is no necessity of decisions or this thing, it is just seeing what is the right thing to do. So this is another aspect of the possibilities of dialogue and questioning. So I think that's probably enough for now. Yeah.
Thank you, Harji. Thank you. Thank you for making it so clear. We have something coming from Philip, Mr. Philip Joshua. Would you like to unmute yourself and then ask the question? Unmute us. Yes, please go ahead. Unmute yourself. Unmute. Yeah.
Yeah. Good morning to all. In a normal dialogue, in case one of the parties is not even agreeing to the other point of view, what is the way forward? Totally is not agreeing to the other point, without any clash, how do you really put forward your thing and go forward?
Well, that is the normal situation. I grew up in a culture where the custom was to contradict everybody. Somehow that is the way we find to assert ourselves, to deny the other. So
you mean the academic world?
Yeah, no, but that's the ordinary world as well.
Yes.
These sort of people just have a way of just saying no. do whatever you say. That you see, look at just that we are in the habit of mutual denial, right? So what happens in contradiction? Contradiction is itself a sign that there is not a common perception of the fact. If perceiving the fact is what matters to us, then we have to be able to suspend our opinions and look past them. So if we are at all intelligent about that fact of the disagreement, we realize that the truth is missing from our conversation. And therefore we have to suspend those opinions and begin to look past them, through them. There's no real there's no real fight, therefore, necessary, unless people have a total conviction concerning their opinions. But the fact that contradiction exists, as I say, to me signifies that the perception is not common. The perception of the fact is not shared. And if that's what interests us, we have to go past it. Yeah. And therefore, I have to suspend my opinion sufficiently. If I'm sure of it, then of course, I just will hold on to it and try to beat you on the head with my convictions. But that's not the point, because what we're trying to do is establish a relationship. Yeah. Because we are concerned with each other and with the quality of our lives, which is the quality of our relationship. And therefore, I'm not intent on per se generating a conflict for the sake of my own self-aggrandizement or whatever, self-assertion. I have to watch that too. I can't be self-assertive in terms of my opinions. Opinions are intrinsically uncertain. So we have to be also much more open to consider the uncertainty of our opinions. This is important because most people try to create certainty within the field of opinion, and that cannot be done. Only facts are certain, but facts are also changing, and they require not the fixing of a conclusion, but the dynamics of staying with what is. What is not static. So what we are actually asking for in ourselves in dialogue itself is to see if we can develop a quickness of perception, a fluidity of movement, a looseness in relation to the conclusions that we have adopted as the very building blocks of our identities. What we are rigid about is what we are identified with. But if that enters into a contradiction, then we can be sure that our identities are themselves most likely based on false assumptions. So in our pursuit of truth, in our pursuit of wholeness, we have to be able to question, there you have it, these things. I have to question my opinions. The moment there is a contradiction, we have to be able to suspend, observe, and question. Then we can go forward, you see. Somebody just sent some, I was trying to read that, which is a bit distracting, the little chat. I cannot read it at the same time, I'm sorry. But somebody said, well, when you question and the questioner and the question disappear, then you have a proper dialogue. Yes, you can say that. And sometimes we have experienced that, right? But what it means is that it's a kind of exhausting process. You have to exhaust the question. Right? Until you come to the point in which the known no longer answers. This is the thing. We say, knowledge is always limited. Thought is always limited. But that's not how thought presents itself. Thought presents itself as it is so. It asserts, it states a fact, even though it's an opinion. And then because it's my identity, I must defend it with all the strength behind that. I give it the value and meaning of my very life. Whereas it's just an opinion. It's just an image and a concept derived from some past, which itself is questionable. So to come to the end of the limit of thought is part of what dialogue does. part of the meaning of dialogue is this. I mean, I didn't discuss that at all. As Harsh pointed out, I just mentioned sort of questioning and passing. I threw it in because I couldn't help it. It's an essential part, but I didn't go into it at all. So the questioning, and I'm glad that somebody picked up on that, is essential in this regard, that brings us to the edge of the known so that a new insight is necessary. When a contradiction is there, you see, like in science, right? They had Newtonian physics, and then suddenly in the 19th century, they started discovering phenomena that could not be explained by Newtonian classical physics, the black body radiation and all kinds of things, right? So the application of knowledge was no longer applicable, no longer explaining things. They tried to work around it. They kind of tried to invent theories that could adapt it, but in the end couldn't. There are new facts, a new challenge that defies explanation from the known. And our life is full of those. It's not just physics. So a new insight had to come in, right? And then Einstein was there, luckily. But then other people came along and started looking further. And they started contradicting Einstein as well. Not contradicting, but developing another field which Einstein's own theories could not quite explain. Quantum mechanics. So there you are. The dialogue is on. The dialectic is on. A new fact, no explanation. You have to come to the end of knowledge. Advaita Vedanta. You come to the end of knowledge by questioning. And our lives are full of those. You see, in our daily lives, maybe we don't take our issues too seriously or seriously enough to question them so profoundly that we actually come to the end of knowledge and have an insight. This is the field of insight we're trying to awaken. He talked about the awakening of intelligence. Well, insight is the operant principle of intelligence. So that's what we're trying to do, see? To awaken intelligence. That's why Kay was so, I thought later, that's what Kay was so insistent that we should discuss. Was part of coming to the end of our knowledge, realizing the contradictions we were living with, and coming to the end of the known and having an insight. That's what Harsh was trying to point out earlier, right? So look at that. I think that's a beautiful thing that we can do. And sometimes when you do it, you realize the truth of this, right? Often it doesn't happen because we don't push the question into the ending of the known. And with that same intensity, look, I had an insight at Brockwood Park. I just tell you just for the sake of illustration. Of course, I tell you what worked, right, to encourage us, which was I was playing football at Brockwood. I was a teacher. I had to behave myself. But as I was in the football field, I found myself getting really angry. But every time I was kicked by the others. And of course I was kicked. Everybody kicks. So playing football at Brockwood, and I was suddenly getting really, really furious. And I didn't know where that was coming from. And I was creating such an awful atmosphere. Teacher at Brockwood Park, for the love of God. But okay, I was have to next time I won't react. The next time I kick me, you exercise will, right, to change your thing. And next time, of course, when they kicked me, I reacted the same way. It was a reflex thing. So I went to a friend of mine. You see two friends sitting on a bench in the park in the double light, talking about their lives. This was my life. This was a pain in my life. The fact that I was angry, aggressive, and I didn't know why. So my friend questioned me, said, is it this? Is it that? Is it the other? And I said, no. I couldn't find an answer to this question. Why was I so aggressive? And just like that, in the field where it didn't belong, right? So I left that meeting with my friend under the double light with tremendous sense of pain. The pain was even heightened. This was urgent. I needed to solve this because this was completely unacceptable from every point of view. I was creating chaos and feeling awful about it. It was just an inappropriate action, obviously. So I took this pain with me and not knowing what the answer was. And about 2-3 days later, walking down the central corridor, the major traffic highway of Brockwood Park, I saw it, or there was an insight. The mind was able to access its own conditioned layers. What was it? It was me, when I was 9 years old, back in my village, being massively bullied and at school, and saying to myself, I will not tolerate any physical aggression to my body. My body is sacred. And when somebody attacks it, I will react with all I got. It was operating, what, over 20 years or 20 odd years later, blindly where it did not belong. This is what happens with our conditioning. And to be able to access, look what it takes. That's a minor thing, if you like. It was a personal little glitch that I had set into my consciousness for my own self-defense, right? Against the brutality of my environment. And yet now I am the brutal one in another environment where it doesn't belong. See the total contradiction, the total irony of that process. But therefore, to have an insight is fundamental for human freedom. And we're talking about much deeper layers of conditioning than just this little kid's emotional self-instruction. Understand? So we have to move. Really, the questioning has to go to that level of pain. We are in pain, if we care to look at it. But that is the energy of the urgency to find out. When it's coupled with not knowing, and yet the flame of intent is alive, the chances are insight might be released. I say released because insight is like a flash. It's like you see, and that's true, and there's no question about it. Then you can argue if you like, but that has happened, and there's no two ways about it. And there is freedom. I felt quite, Brockwood Park is a good place. It helps me to be free, at least that much. As Harsh knows, there were many other layers, so we have to still going. Right? This is what we're saying, to push the questioning so that you come to the ending of the known, but you have still the urge to find out. That cannot be ignored. That's the flame of intent. Kay talked about that. Not intention, not motivation, right? Just to escape from pain. No, to find out what is true, right? And pain may be a great indicator of what is wrong with us, and therefore may have the energy. That's what gives us the urgency to find out. But one has to come to that end of the known, and then, if you are lucky, Kay used to say sometimes, if you are lucky, you will see what is true.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. We had something from Mr. Prasad. Please go ahead. You have number of points to say, Mr. Prasad. Then we go to Dinesh ji. Mr. Prasad is not responding.
Sorry, sir, I was on mute actually.
Are you able to speak now?
1 second. Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Sir, actually, I don't have any. I have few thoughts which I posted in the chat actually. So hope they give a little bit of insight. Hope my understanding will be helpful to others.
Okay, sir. Okay. So we'll go to Dinesh ji now. Please unmute yourself. Mr. Dinesh Wagmare. Unmute. Yeah. Go ahead.
Are you able to listen to me?
Yes, yes.
Mr. Javier, I want to just further, please further elaborate on the fourth leg you said, of either silence or listening or whatever you were saying. Please explain or elaborate further on that fourth leg.
The question of listening is, of course,
Listening, right?
yeah, that's what you're talking about, right? What I had mentioned as the fourth pillar, so-called.
Yeah.
Well, that's my way of organizing things only. It's inbuilt in the whole thing. It's not separate, obviously. You can say very simply, look, if one is not able to listen, then there's no real communication. But listening has depth to it. I used to think to myself, why does Kate talk all the time? But it wasn't because of the words mostly, but because of his trust in the quality of listening to provide the depth of understanding. Now, suppose I have a child, which I do, and he comes to me and says, Papa, I have this issue. I have to be able to listen. I don't know if I can meet the challenge that he's got, but at least I have to be able to provide the space in which he can explore it to the fullest extent. Without listening, there's no communication. But to what degree do we listen? Right? There's so much nonsense going on in the world. Listening also has the quality, if it's true, to be able to tell the chaff, separate the chaff from the grain. Can one see that much of what we're being told is absolute nonsense? Calculated to manipulate, to mislead, to sustain an unfair and unjust system, to promote self-interest at every level, that there is deception. Listening is not just that one hears what is being said and goes along. It means to have the sharpness of perception that can distinguish what is true and what is false. That is a difficult art. I wouldn't know if there was a method, we would have applied it long ago. It's a delicate art. Partly what I work on is whether it's contradictory. I lean on that capacity of the mind to detect incoherences in order to then question, because what is incoherent is questionable. Listening provides the evidence of whether the thing is coherent or incoherent. So that is a ground, important ground, but it goes further, because listening itself is like it has no content. It's already a kind of emptiness that is required for everything to be heard. Kay used to talk about himself as being a drum. His consciousness was a drum. It itself makes no sound, but when it's hit with the right intent, when the question is thrown at it and it's the right question, then it always gives the right sound. Beautiful. I thought, what a mind is this? But maybe that's the nature of mind, to be silent at depth. And when the question is thrown, is able to answer truthfully, because it has no distorting factor in which to perceive, from which to perceive the thing as it is. We're talking a bit theoretically, because this is the normal situation is different. We seem to lack that depth of silence, that depth of listening. Look, you know this also, that when the upper layers of the mind are not busy, when we're not self-occupied, the quality of understanding of another, as well as the inner perceptions of our own psychological movements, are much clearer. The noise, psychological noise, is preventing us from communicating, from capturing the actual meaning of what's going on. So, and then that allows, for example, deeper layers of consciousness to emerge, our conditioning to be revealed. Consciousness structures itself in layers. To be able to access or to be able to allow the expression, the display of the deeper layers the upper layer of consciousness must come to some relative rest, hopefully all complete rest. I'm just saying you have to give space for the deeper layers to be heard, to be perceived. So listening also has to do with the ability of the consciousness itself to access its deeper content. If we're talking about meditation as the emptying of consciousness of its content, we're not talking only upper but lower. We're talking about the layering of consciousness freeing itself. We're not trapped in the past. Our identity is not yesterday's remembrance, but it's a living present that has no name. Huh? This is the
Okay,
beauty
thank you.
Kay is proposing.
Javier. Arshad Bhai, would you like to say something? Unmute yourself. Yeah. Unmute. Yeah. Yes, yeah. We can't hear you. Can't hear you. Some problem with the audio. Sushil ji,
Yes, sir. You have to declare the next Sunday's program by Professor Krishna.
since there are no questions now, I'll
Yeah.
thank Javier once again. Thanks a lot for accepting our
Thank-
request and being with this group. We maybe a few months from now will request you again. But in the meantime, thanks a lot. And next Sunday at 11 o'clock, we'll have Professor P. Krishna, his talk, and we'll send you the notice as soon as possible. Thank you all so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dubey sir.
Thank you,
And
sir.
thank you, guest speaker,
Thank you very much.
and all participants.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you all.
Please close.
Yeah.